With setups now created for every track in F1 25, I wanted to create this video as a single collection of every single dry setup. This is going to be a long video as it's a collection of all 24 setups so far. I'll leave links in the description below so you can quickly jump between setups or find the one you're after. All of these setups were created with a racing wheel and are designed for medium to long race distances. The second half of the season, I did make a switch to slightly prioritise straight line speed a bit more, so the first few setups may need the aero lowering by 5 clicks or so to stay competitive with the super fast AI down the straights. Now before I jump into these setups, I do want to mention our sponsor for all of our F1 25 videos this year, and that is our very own F1 25 Pro car setups. The Pro setups are created by drivers who are among the fastest around and features 6 or 7 car setups for every single track in F1 25. They also include recommended strategies to use in quali in the race, along with other data such as tyre wear and ERS strategies. I'm going to leave a link in the description below as well as in the top corner right now. And with that, let's jump into the first car setup, and this year it's for Australia. With the aero, I've gone with 21 at the front and 17 at the rear. This year there isn't as much front end grip as we did have last year, meaning the cars have a tendency to understeer. A bit of understeer is fine as it adds stability during a longer race, but we don't want too much because then the car becomes hard to rotate. Lowering the rear wing angle down to 17 is enough to allow the car to rotate pretty well, and a setup of 21 and 17 will make you incredibly quick down the straights, even compared to the fast top speeds of the AI. With the transmission, it's a bit of a carryover from last year with the tendency to have a high on-throttle diff and a much lower off-throttle. This allows for good rotation at slower speeds while giving it a good push under acceleration. I haven't set the on-throttle to 100, instead leaving it at 90%, and this just adds a tiny bit more stability, especially through the final corner. Then go with 45% off-throttle. If you go much lower, the car becomes a little too willing to rotate, making it harder to drive. Talking about carryovers from last year, the trend with the suspension geometry is to go full left once again. There really isn't much need to increase them, so I'd recommend setting them all to the left pretty much at every single track and swiftly moving on. With the suspension, things look pretty extreme. I've set the suspension to 41 at the front and just 2 at the rear, then the ARBs to 12 and 21 with a ride height of 21 and 49. It looks pretty aggressive, although some time trial and league setups take this concept to an even bigger extreme. By keeping the front ARB up at 12, the car is slightly less likely to over-rotate and oversteer, and in combination with other parts of this car setup, it produces a car that's willing to turn while remaining stable at higher speeds. Our brake setup remains really neutral with a bias of 54% and a pressure of 100%. You can play about with the bias, moving it slightly more forward for some of the heavier braking zones such as turn 3 and 11. But don't move it too far forward, otherwise you're going to start suffering from some lockups. Finally, with the tyre setup, I've increased them all by quite a bit. I've set the front pressures to 29 psi and the rears to 26. This high approach helps with cooling the tyres during longer duration races, although I haven't set the front tyres to their maximum, as the hard tyre in particular, especially at the front right of the car, does have a tendency to struggle to heat up when set to max pressure. I've gone with an aero setup of 24 on the front wing and 21 on the rear. This approach will allow the car to turn into corners such as turns 1, 6 and 11, while the offset of just 3 between front and rear won't cause too much rear instability. The AI in this game are quick in a straight line, much like they were in F1 24. This setup will keep up with them, but you can lower both front and rear wings together to improve your straight line speed a little bit. Now I've set the on-throttle diff to 90 while setting the off-throttle to 45, and this is actually identical to my previous F1 25 Australia setup, and it's an approach that balances rotation and stability with the off-throttle while not locking the on-throttle diff entirely, which can cause some oversteer moments. The geometry is once again set to the full left for everything, and it should be like that at most tracks. The suspension setup is set to 41 and 1 with anti-roll bars of 4 and 8 and 21 and 48 on the ride height. The 41 and 1 approach on the suspension is going to be a trend at most circuits, while the anti-roll bars are softer than my Australian car setup. Going stiffer can result in some instability through some of the really long corners and can result in the rear of the car actually giving up on you if you push them too far. The ride height is pretty much as low as we can go without sacrificing too much drag by scraping along that back straight. With the brake setup, I've set the bias to 56%, which is actually pretty high. You'll often see time trial setups lowering the bias right down to 50% in some cases, which really helps with rotation. During a race though, we want stability, hence the higher bias. This also helps with front tyre warm-up, as it's the front tyres around China which can struggle to heat up. Then set the pressure to 100% as per normal. Finally, the tyre setup comes away from the near maximum approach that we became really used to in F1 24. I've gone with 25.5 on both fronts and 24.5 on both rears. This middling approach is targeted at preventing some heat build-up at the rear with the higher pressures, while keeping the fronts low enough to allow them to get up to the right temperature during a stint. If you push the tyres incredibly hard or are noticing excess tyre wear, you can increase both front and rear pressures as needed. I've set it to 30 at the front and 32 at the rear. This approach of inverting the wings to be higher at the rear really adds to the overall stability, as Suzuka rear stability is crucial through the long, twisting corners. The good news is that with the rest of the setup, we aren't suffering from any understeer, so we can really run this rear-focused aero. Now, the AI in F1 25 can be incredibly strong on the straights, and this setup will have you finding a lot of time against the AI through the twisty sectors 1 and 2, but losing a little bit on the straights. For a lower downforce approach, lower both wings to around say 28 at the front and 30 at the rear. The transmission is similar to previous setups for Australia and China. I have the on throttle at 90% for good drive and not too much oversteer, and the off throttle is set to 40%, which is a touch lower than our other setups, which helps rotate the car into the corner. With the geometry, you've guessed it, I've got everything set to the left once again. The suspension is set up to allow the car to drive consistently without any erratic behaviour. I've gone for 41 and 9 on the front and rear suspension, and 10 and 19 on the anti-roll bars. With the corners being so long at Suzuka compared to tracks such as Australia, the higher rear suspension stiffness really helps, as does the rear anti-roll bar being lower than the maximum. I've then set the ride height to a fairly balanced 22 and 46. We don't want too much rake in the car as Suzuka, otherwise the rear is going to feel really light and you're going to get a lot of over rotation. I've gone and set the brake bias to 55%, which is quickly becoming my favourite route with the bias in 25. You can then adjust this from corner to corner, and I'd recommend manually lowering it into the slow hairpin at turn 11. Then set the pressure to 100%. Now at Suzuka, it's the rear tyres that overheat despite the high loads on the front through the first sector. For this reason, I've set the rear pressures to maximum to mitigate as much temperature build-up as possible. Then I've set the front pressures to 28.8, which is just below maximum. Really, to maximise your lap time, you'll want a high downforce setup, but racing against the AI, this approach will destroy you down the long straights. So I've gone for a medium downforce approach with 34 at the front and 29 at the rear of the car. This gives you good turning ability at slower speeds, while the quite large offset between front and rear wings allows for good rotation. With Bahrain being so tough on rear tyre wear, I've addressed this slightly with the transmission. I've set the on-throttle diff to just 75%. Again, in a true time trial setup, this will be much higher to extract more performance, but lowering it down will help with preventing wheel spin and keeping those rear tyre temperatures down. I've then set the off-throttle diff to 40%. We don't need it too low as we've got pretty good rotation from the aero offset, so this can be more neutral. Once again, with the suspension geometry, I've set it all the way to the left on every value. Then for the suspension, I've set the front and rear setup pretty much as extreme as they can go with 41 and 2. Then I moved the front ARBs up to 10 for slightly better stability and set the rear ARBs just to 19. Then the ride height of 22 and 48 keeps your car low to the ground to minimise drag. I've gone ahead and set the brake bias to 55% again. This works really well as there are some heavy braking zones such as turn 1, plus having the bias more towards the front will reduce those rear tyre temperatures ever so slightly, and then set the brake pressure to 100%. For the tyre pressures, this looks very similar to my previous setup. It's all about managing the rear tyre temps, so I've set them as high as they'll go. Then I've lowered the front pressures slightly to 28.5 psi, just to help maintain the correct temperature window. I've set the front wing to 9 and the rear to 7. This focus on front aero will allow the car to turn quickly while throwing your car into the fast chicanes that are throughout a whole lap of Jeddah. I would have gone for a slightly larger wing gap, however we do need a stable rear end, as it can be quite easy to lose the rear through turns 9 and 16 if you set it too low. Now most of the corners around Jeddah are medium to high speed, and this lets us run the on-throttle diff pretty high. I've set it at 90% with that last 10% missing just due to those slower heavy traction zones of turns 2 and 27. Then go and set your off-throttle diff to 45%, which provides a bit of help with slower speed rotation while also remaining stable throughout a lap. Then with the suspension geometry, once again go all the way left for everything. And for the suspension, this is actually the first time I've run inverted anti-roll bars. I've set the front and rear suspension to 41 and 1, while the ARBs are set to 14 and 10. Then I've set the ride height to 20 and 46. This is pretty much as low as you'll want to go with the car, and you should really avoid getting beached on the higher curbs through turns 8, 9 and 10. Now I've set the brake bias to 55% once again for this setup, and this works really well as there are some heavy braking zones. Plus having the bias more forward, just like in our other setups, will also help reduce those rear tyre temperatures, which are the ones that can get up pretty high. Then set your brake pressure to 100% and round out this setup by setting all tyre pressures to their maximum. Again, this is designed to prolong the tyre life, which can spike at certain parts of this circuit. With the aero, I've set the front wing exactly the same as our Jeddah setup with a setting of 9. However, I have increased the rear wing compared to Jeddah, bringing it level with the front, also at 9. This even aero balance is needed because Miami has a much bigger emphasis on rear stability compared to the previous race. This setup approach will let us run slightly more aggressive suspension setup with a lot of rotation into the corners, handled by the suspension and the mechanical grip rather than the aero. Another area where this Miami setup differs from Jeddah is with the transmission. The off-throttle is the same at 45%, however the on-throttle diff is significantly lower at just 70%. This is because some corners such as turns 3, 16, 17 and 18 all test the traction and downforce at the rear of the car. With a more aggressive 90 to 100% on throttle, these corners can get a little bit squirmy. Now with the suspension geometry, it's no surprise I've gone left, 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 left once again. Then the suspension is set up for good rotation as well as responsiveness and keeping one eye on the stability of the rear of the car. Go with 41 and 6 on the suspension itself and 12 and 16 on the ARBs. Then go and set your ride height to 20 and 47. The only corner you really need to watch for with this lower ride height is through turn 2 and the inside curb of the final corner, which you should try to avoid at all costs, otherwise it can really rotate your car. I've set the brake bias to 55% again for this setup. This works really well around this track and most tracks in F125 because it helps keep some of the heat into the front tyres rather than the rear, because you're putting more braking force through the front, heats up the brakes more, heats up the front tyres more, and removes it from the rear, which is the kind of big problem point with F125, which is rear tyre temperatures. Then, as always, set your brake pressure to 100%. And then go ahead and set your tyre pressure to maximum, again, just to try and reduce wear, keep temperatures down a little bit. Around Miami, the rears can get really hot, so max temperatures just goes a little bit to lower the heat build-up. I've gone for 39 on the front wing and 36 on the rear. This is still relatively high downforce compared to what the AI use, but it is lower than our Pro setups. This means we're sacrificing some outright pace through the corners, but adding some top speed on the straights. If you're racing on higher AI difficulties and the AI are still driving away from you, try lowering both front and rear wings, and you can go down to around 33, 34 on the front or 30 on the rear. One way we can help with a bit of drive out of that last corner and onto the back straight is to lower our on-throttle differential to 65%. This medium setup approach can also help with traction out of the slipperier corners such as turns 7, 12 and 15. Then set your off-throttle diff to 40%. Then with the geometry, this is quick, you've guessed it, it's all the way to the left for every setup option again. With the suspension, I've gone for a setup of 40 and 3, and then 14 and 19 on the ARBs. This provides good stability through the medium and higher speed corners, and then set your ride height to 23 and 50, which is enough rake to help the car rotate, while also keeping an eye on maximising our straight line speed. Set the brake bars to 55%, although you can play with this up and down 1 or 2% throughout a lap on the entry to different corners, and then set the brake pressure to 100% as always. For the tyre pressures, the rears can get easily overloaded at Imola, especially if you're sliding the car through the fast left-right corner sequences. Go with 27 psi on both front tyres to keep them in the working temperature window, and then set the rears to 26.5 psi for the best heat management. With the aero, it's no surprise that I've gone for 50 on both front and rear wings. You need all the downforce you can get around Monaco, so that's where we've ended up. For the transmission, lowering the on-throttle differential to just 50% will help you maximise your traction. You can go lower, although it will come at the cost of some initial push out of the corners. Set the off-throttle differential to an equally low 30% for excellent rotation at slow speed. Then, suspension geometry, again leave it all the way left for everything. And with this suspension, I've gone for 39 and 6, followed by 12 and 18 on the anti-roll bars. This ARB setup is actually pretty high for such a slow speed circuit, but it does help a lot with overall stability. Then set your ride height to 20 and 50. For the brakes, a slightly more rearward brake bias of 54% is ideal. Setting this too high will increase your risk of locking up due to the slow corner speeds and bumpy track surface. Then, as always, go with 100% brake pressure. The tyre pressures can be low around Monaco as tyre temperature buildup isn't as high. Go with 24.5 at both fronts and 22.5 psi for both rears. And this should give you good balance between traction as well as temperature management. I've gone for an aero setup of 31 and 29. This prioritises the front of the car, while also ensuring the rear has enough downforce to stay planted through the long corners such as turn 4. There isn't too much of a wing gap here, however I have ensured we do have enough mechanical grip and rotation with the rest of the setup to ensure that understeer isn't an issue. And that all starts with the transmission, with the off-throttle diff set low at just 35%. This will let the car pivot and rotate better at slower speed, making up for the high rear wing. Then I've gone with an on-throttle diff of 70%, which is about right as corners such as 5, 7 and 10 can really test your rear traction. We don't want to push this up too high. With the geometry, once again, go left on everything. And then suspension wise, as I mentioned, Spain does reward responsiveness, and our suspension is set up to deliver this. Go 41 and 3, followed by 10 and 21 on the anti-roll bars. This juggles stability and responsiveness well, while ensuring there isn't too much lean on the car through the longer corners where the ARBs can give up on you. Follow this with a ride height of 20 and 47. For the brake setup, I've gone with 54% once again, similar to our Monaco setup. There isn't really much need to run it higher. Most of the braking zones are pretty short and sweet, with even turn 1 not being too much of a heavy stop. Then go 100% brake pressure. Finally, tyre wear is a huge problem at Spain, especially at the rear of the car. I've set all pressures to maximum to minimise wear as much as possible. However, this will be one area where you're going to need to focus on while driving during a race. Staying smooth, not aggressive on the throttle, and not following cars too closely will all help keep those temperatures down. I've set mine to 19 and 18 for front and rear wings respectively. This is much lower than I'd ideally like, but it's kind of needed to be able to contend for overtakes down that back straight. The fairly small wing gap also ensures that the rear of the car remains stable in places where it's really tested, such as turns 2, 6 and 9. With the transmission setup, I have the on-throttle set reasonably low at 65%. This helps through the heavy traction zones. Even though the circuit is pretty fast, the rear can get away from you at a good number of corners. Lowering the on-throttle diff will give you slightly more control and traction out of these tricky spots. Then I have the off-throttle set to 35% to help the car rotate a bit better into corners. And this makes up a little bit for that higher rear aero setup. With the suspension geometry, go left, 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 left again. And then for the suspension, go 28 and 4 and 13 and 21 on the ARBs. This is a relatively universal approach for many faster circuits, and it helps the rear of the car stay planted during tricky corners. And then set the ride height to 20 and 50. Much like the last two circuits, I have the bias set to 54%. We don't really want to go too high with this, as it can result in some initial corner entry understeer we really want to avoid at Canada. I would increase this manually heading into the hairpin and final corners before reducing it back down to 54% after turn 2. Then round out the brake setup with 100% pressure. Now, partially due to the long back straight, the front tyres can struggle to get up to temperature. I've set the pressures at 26.9 psi to help keep them in the best window, while setting the rears to 25.5. I've gone pretty low downforce with 24 and 21. Time trial setups and more aggressive setups such as our Pro setup for Austria normally run much higher downforce, which does allow for better overall lap times. When competing against the AI though, we do need to focus on more low downforce than we'd really like. This setup lets you hit those high top speeds along the pit straight and after turn 1 and 3, making your car really competitive throughout a whole race distance. At Austria, an on-throttle differential setup of 75% is just about right. You can manually adjust this during a race. I would recommend lowering it ahead of turn 3 and then increasing it back up right after. That's the biggest traction zone around this track, and a lower on-throttle diff setup can help you get the power down a little bit easier. I've gone with a fairly balanced 40% off-throttle diff, which then helps keep the car tight and stable on corner entry. The suspension geometry, left, 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 left as always. And then with this being a pretty full-on track, I've run the most aggressive suspension setup you can at 41 and 1. This will let the car respond incredibly well through those fast corners. Then go with anti-roll bars of 9 and 19, followed by a higher than normal ride height of 22 and 49. Some of the curves around the Red Bull ring can be pretty high, and the track's also pretty bumpy in places. So setting the ride height much lower at the front can result in some unintended consequences. For the brakes, a setup of 54 or 55% bias is good. I'd increase it up to 56% heading into turn 3, but then use 54-55% for the rest of the circuit. And finally go with 100% brake pressure. Then the tyre pressures work best when not actually set to maximum around this track. Despite the heavy loads on the front tyres through the last sector in particular. Go 27.5 on both fronts and 25.4 psi on the rears, round out this car setup. Starting with the aero, to ensure we have a stable rear end, I've prioritised the rear wing. I've gone with 19 at the front and 21 at the rear. This will move the aero balance more rearward and allow us to be a little bit more aggressive with acceleration out of some of those medium speed corners. Then I've set the on-throttle diff to just 60%. This is again designed for maximum traction. You can increase it all the way up to 100% if you do feel confident in the car. However, I have found after a few laps, as the tyres wear down, having the on-throttle differential close to 100% starts to make things a little bit too slippery, hence the lower and more stable approach. Then I have the off-throttle differential at 40%, which is roughly where I like it at most tracks. With the suspension geometry, it's no surprise, go left on everything. And then, much like our Austria setup, I've set the suspension to 41 and 1 once again. This helps a lot with traction at the rear of the car, which is a big focus point here. I've then gone with 16 on the front ARB, which is actually pretty high for an F125 setup. This boosts our overall stability by making the car slightly less twitchy. Then set the rear ARB to 21. For the ride height, a middle ground approach of 21 at the front and 46 at the rear is good. This isn't too low that you can be scraping the ground too often, while the ride height is pretty balanced between high speed performance and overall downforce. Then set your brake bias to 55% and the pressure to 100%. And to round out this Silverstone car setup, I've set all tyre pressures to maximum. You can play with lowering the rear pressures for a little bit more traction. However, be warned, this will add increased temperature buildup and lead to the tyres wearing a bit faster during a race if you don't correctly manage your wheel spin. Talking of the aero, for such a fast circuit, we want to minimise drag as much as possible. For this reason, I have the front wing set right down to just 3 and the rear set to 0. This will give us a car that is as slippery as possible with the incredibly long runs down the Kemmel straight and that kink during the long straight at the rear of the track. Having a front wing of 3 will give the car a little bit more bite when turning into some of the medium to fast corners, such as Les Combes. Follow this up with an on-throttle differential of 85%. The high-speed nature of Spa, we can really push our transmission setup to give us the best oomph out of the fastest corners. But as I mentioned at the start, you do just need to watch the traction out of the final chicane and out of the first corner. I do like to lower the on-throttle diff manually during a race to anywhere between 50 and 80% as I head through Blanchimont, and then I'll raise it back up after Le Source. Then go ahead and set the off-throttle differential to 45%. We don't need it much lower as the front wing aero and the high-speed nature of Spa doesn't actually require as much rotation from the differential as some tracks do. With the suspension, go left, 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 as always. Then much like Silverstone, setting the suspension to 41 and 1 is the best route around Spa. I've also used the same anti-roll bar setup at the front with 16, and I've set the rear 1 point lower than Silverstone at just 20. This combination will give you a really stable feeling car through those medium and higher speed corners. And the ride height is set to 20 and 48. There are a few bumps here and there, meaning we can't go too much lower in a race with a full load of fuel, and the rear set to 48 just gives good stability at higher speed. I've then gone with 54% on the brake bias. There are a few heavier braking zones, but the majority are shorter, faster spots. This means a slightly more rearward bias of 54% can free up the front of the car a little bit to rotate easier. Then as always, set the pressure to 100%. Finally, like many setups in F1 25, we really want maximum tyre pressures. Despite this long straights, your tyres are going to still get pretty hot through that twistier middle sector, and the increased pressures help reduce this as much as possible. It also has the added bonus of helping increase your top speed, which is always nice around Spa. I've not gone down that normal approach of 50-50 wings, instead I've gone as low as 36-36. This does let you race the AI down the pit straight and into the first corner, and I know from your comments that you guys really value a setup that is slightly more low downforce. If you want to jump into time trial or test a setup with better lap time potential, and you don't mind sacrificing straight line speed, you can push the aero all the way up to 50-50. Hungary is a circuit with a lot of slower corners, and traction out of corners such as 1, 2, 7 and 12, just to name a few, can be hard to come by. For this reason, I've set the on differential to 50% to really help you limit wheel spin as much as possible. Again, this is a different approach to many time trial setups in our pro setups, but it's one of the key differences that make this a good, stable race setup. Set your off-throttle differential lower than normal at just 30%, and this really affects the car on the approach to a corner and helps just rotate it a little bit better. With the geometry, you've guessed it, left, 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 left again. And then like with many car setups, I've set the front suspension to 41, but I have bumped the rear suspension up slightly to 4. Being low will aid with traction, but bumping it up slightly just allows for a little bit more rotation mid-corner, and that can be important around some of the longer radius turns you're going to find around Hungary. For the anti-roll bars, I flip things on the head, all in the name of stability. Go with a super high 17 on the front and just 15 on the rear. This helps keep your car facing the right way and prevents a lot of over-rotation that can happen when your ARBs become overloaded through longer turns. Then set the ride height to 21 and 48. You will be all over the curves at Hungary, some of which are quite high, and the track itself can be bumpy in places, so a slightly higher ride height can be beneficial. I've set the brake bias to 54%, which can really help reduce front locking into corners such as turn 13, where your inside left tyre often locks, and then set the pressure to 100% like normal. For the tyres, I've lowered the front pressures ever so slightly, and this will help them grip the track a little bit more, providing a bit more mechanical grip as well as keeping them in the right temperature window. And bump the rears right to maximum as they're going to heat up super fast. Now starting with the aero, as always, this is one of the most important parts of your setup at any track, but especially Zandvoort. Set the front wing to 34 and the rear to 36. Now I've gone this low on the wings to really make this a setup that's competitive with the AI, and this is very much a low downforce approach. The rear bias also allows the car to stay planted to the track. Zandvoort features a lot of fast corners where your rear stability and traction is really tested. Turns 1, 3, 9 and 12 are all areas where the back of the car can get away from you, but that is somewhat alleviated with this setup. The transmission is a part of our setup that lets us tune both for traction and drive out of corners, as well as rotation. I have the on-throttle differential set at a reasonably high 75%. This is high enough that you'll get good drive on the exit of the faster corners, while being slightly lower to accommodate for the heavier traction zones that I just mentioned. The off-throttle diff is set to 30, which is designed to make up for our focus on rear aero. Having this set pretty low will help your car rotate and turn into and through some of the slower corners with a little bit more ease. As with all of our setups, go left, 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 left on the suspension geometry. And I've once again opted for a 41 and 1 approach on the suspension. Having the rear of the car as soft as possible lets the car really drop and grip up on the exit of a corner. I have a pretty stiff front anti-roll bar at 15 and rear at 19, and this helps keep your car relatively stable through the faster direction changes. Then a ride height of 21 and 49 is a bit on the higher side, but this is a bumpy track where you'll be hitting quite a few curbs as well. If you go much lower than this, you can really start to bottom out at some places. The brakes have gone a little lower than normal on the bias at just 53%. A super front focused bias isn't really needed here, as many of the braking zones require some form of rotation during the braking phase, so we can use the bias, setting it a little bit more rearward to help us rotate the car, then go with 100% pressure. Now, Zandvoort can be a killer on tyre wear, much like tracks like Spain, so I have all pressures set to maximum for this setup. Now I'm going to waste no time at all and jump right into the aero, as this is probably the easiest aero to set up for the entire game. There really is no other way to go than 0 on both front and rear wings. You could, if you really want to, add 1, 2, maybe even 3 clicks of front wing, help with a little bit more rotation, but it's really not needed for a race setup. With the transmission, there are 2 distinct areas we need to optimize, and this ultimately results in you having to change your differential setup during the race. First of all, there are the super slow chicanes in the first and second sectors, which ideally require a low on-throttle differential to help with traction. And then there's the rest of the track, which is all medium and higher speed, which will benefit from a much higher diff. Now, I've gone reasonably in the middle with 75%, and this is a relatively good set it and forget it choice. But to really get the most out of the car around Monza, I definitely recommend lowering it on your way to the first chicane and then increasing it as you head out of the 2 Lesmo corners. Then go with 25% off throttle, which is incredibly low. This just helps you get the car turned into the slow chicane without much need for any increased front wing angle. Then with geometry, I've set it all the way to the left for everything once again. And for the suspension setup, I've gone with a pretty standard approach of 41-1, followed by 9 and 21 on the anti-roll bars. This setup will give us the best traction at slow speed while keeping the car responsive and stable thanks to our ARBs. Go with 21 and 49 on the ride height, which is rather intentionally high to avoid porpoising along the pit straight, and to also allow you to hit the higher curves with a bit more confidence. A pretty neutral brake bias of 55% is ideal at Monza. It allows for good performance in the majority of corners, and can even be increased to 56% heading into that first chicane if you want a little bit more stopping power. If you do this, just watch out for front lock-in. Then go with 100% brake pressure. With the tyre setup, I've gone with the maximum pressures all round. This will aid with top speed, increasing it as much as possible, but it also helps battle tyre temperature build-up and ultimately tyre wear. If you really are struggling for traction, you can lower the rear pressures, say to around medium, and this will just increase the contact patch with the track, but it can result in a bit more tyre temperature build-up. This combination of slow corners and fast straights means we have to create a low downforce setup that still has good rotation and even better traction. To achieve this, I've set the aero to 10 at the front and 9 at the rear. This is very low downforce with time trial setups, often opting for the mid-teens on both front and rear wing. While rear traction is important, it's more important to have a car that doesn't understeer, otherwise you're going to be throwing away a lot of lap time around Baku. The transmission setup is where we can start to dial in the behaviour out of the corner, as well as on the entry. The on throttle is set at 65%, and this is relatively middling, not too high and aggressive, but not too low that you're going to lose a lot of time through those faster corners. If you are struggling for traction out of slower corners, you can lower this even further to 40-50% to prevent a little more wheel spin. I've then gone and set the off throttle diff to 25%, which will help us rotate better on the entry to some of those slower corners. With the geometry, as always, go left, 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 left. And because traction is key, I've left the rear suspension set up to just 1 to allow the car to squat down and grip up under acceleration, then set the front suspension to 41. For the anti-roll bars, I'm running them at 12 and 18, and this is tailored more towards stability, which is very important through the middle and final sectors at Baku, then go with the ride height of 20 and 47. I've opted for 54% on the brake bias, and despite there being a lot of straight braking zones, having the bias slightly more rearward can open up the car to rotate a little bit better into a corner. This helps us get the car turned into the slow and medium speed corners while trail braking, and then set the pressure to 100% as always. Finally, for the tyres, I've opted for 29 psi on the front, which is just below maximum. We want our tyre pressures high for the best straight line speed. However, when set to max, the fronts were staying just a little bit too cold for my liking. Then set the rear pressures to max, as they're going to take a lot of punishment through all of those heavy acceleration and traction zones, and this can cause them to overheat really easily. For that reason, I'm running the wings at 37 on both front and rear. This is very much a race car setup, designed for career mode or my team, hence the lower than normal aero. If you do find that you're struggling through the twisty bits, you can increase the front and rear together up to 40 or beyond. However, doing this will have a negative effect when battling the AI down the straights. One really big challenge around Singapore is rear traction. Throughout a race, as the tyres wear down, you'll find yourself sliding more and more. So to help mitigate some of this oversteer and sliding, I've set the on-throttle differential to just 40%. This will give you better traction out of the slower corners, and this can go even lower if you are really struggling. Then set the off-throttle differential equally low at just 25%. This helps the car rotate on corner entry and makes up for the setup using equal front and rear wings by giving it a little bit more bite into the corner. With the geometry, I've gone left again. Then for the suspension, the 41-1 approach works really well here as it helps with traction under acceleration. Then I've set the anti-roll bars similar to our recent Baku car setup at 15 and 18. The front anti-roll bars are slightly higher than Baku to help stabilize the car a little bit more. Finally, finish the suspension setup with a ride height of 21 and 50. This ride height is on the higher side as top speed really isn't as important at Singapore, and we have already factored it in with our aero. What it will do though is prevent you from getting beached on some of those higher curbs, which can happen really easily here and have really bad consequences with the walls so close, especially at turns 7 and 17. For the brake setup, go with 54% bias, which is designed to take a little load off the fronts compared to setting it at say 55 or 56. I did experiment with lowering it even further to 53%, however I found the occasional instance of rear lock-in, meaning 54% is a safer choice for a race, and go 100% brake pressure. With the tyre pressures, the fronts do struggle to come up to temperature, and for this reason and for a little more grip at the front of the car, I've lowered the pressures to 27 psi. However, because of the insane rear temperatures at Singapore, I've set the rear tyres to maximum. Kicking off this COTA car setup, I have the aero set to 35 at both front and rear. This is designed to be competitive with the AI on the straights, which is very, very important here, with that really long straight in the middle sector. It also prioritises the rear of the car a bit more by not having a front wing offset. COTA really tests your rear stability from turn 1 all the way through to turn 10, as well as the final sector. The rear of your car will always want to get away from you as you throw it through the fast turns. Turn 9 in particular can make the rear of your car go really light, so a little bit extra focus on rear downforce is important. With the differential, I have the on-throttle set at just 65%. Now you think with a faster circuit this could be higher, however turns 1 and 11 and the entire final sector all feature pretty heavy traction zones. Setting the diff closer to 100% can make these corners tricky to navigate. Instead, the lower setup approach will make the car much more consistent to drive throughout a race. You can go ahead and manually increase it through say sector 1 if you want a little bit more performance. Then I've set the off-throttle to 30%, primarily to accommodate the slower second half of the lap. With the geometry, go left as always, and for the suspension I'm running the front at the usual 41 and the rear at a pretty high 10. This will help the car rotate well and stay responsive. Then go at 17 and 21 on your ARBs for added stability at high speed. You'll find this approach will stiffen the car up and promote a little bit more understeer, so if you're aiming for fast time trial laps or competitive league racing, the rear suspension and front ARB can be lowered significantly, just as they are in our Pro F125 car setups. Round out the suspension here with a ride height of 21 and 48. For the brake bias, I've gone for 53%. Most of the corners other than turn 11 and 12 will want some rotation during the braking phase. Moving the bias rearward will help rotate the front of the car initially. If you do experience any rear lock-in into the heavier braking zones, you can manage this mid-race from your MFD by adjusting it further forward, then go 100% brake pressure. For the tyres, I've set the fronts to maximum and the rears lower at just 25.5 psi. This setup brings both front and rear into the correct operating window, and the lower the maximum rear pressures will also help slightly better with traction at slower speed. Starting with the aero setup, I've opted for a relatively low downforce approach of 29 on both front and rear. Pit straight is incredibly long, and that's followed by another medium length straight right after it. Running a higher downforce setup targeted at the middle or last sector will leave you incredibly vulnerable down these two long straights. I've opted for equal wings on front and rear, as any additional downforce we can get at the rear of the car around Mexico will make the car that much easier to drive. With incredibly slow corners such as turns 4, 5 and 6, as well as the super slow final stadium section, rear traction is crucial. I've set the on-throttle differential really low at just 45% to target these parts of the track. Now you can manually raise this using the MFD mid-race if you want a little more push through the faster corners. Then I have the off-throttle differential low at just 25%. This will promote some slower speed rotation, which is needed when we're running the front and rear wings at the same value. With the geometry left left as always, and then the suspension I've set to 37 and 4 rather than the commonly used 41 and 1. This will soften the front a little bit more, making the car more compliant over some of the curbs, of which there are plenty that you'll want to be attacking around Mexico. Then go with 15 and 20 on the anti-roll bars, and this approach will stabilise the car a little bit more at medium and higher speed. Round out the suspension with a ride height of 22 and 50, which is pretty high, but again it's needed for some of those curbs and to prevent porpoising on that really long straight. Set the brake bias to 53%, and this is low, but it frees the front of the car up a little bit more under braking, helping it rotate quicker, and then run the pressures at 100% like normal. Finally, tyre pressures are set to 28.5 psi on the front and 25.5 on the rear. The high pressure will reduce rolling resistance, which increases our top speed, and this setup also keeps all tyres in the working temperature window. Now, while rear stability and aero is important, I have set the wings to 26 and 25, and this gives the front of the car slightly more priority. This is designed to help ensure you don't understeer through those longer corners, which will lose you so much time. The on-throttle diff is set pretty high at 70%. You'll often be accelerating gradually as you round the apexes at most of these long corners, meaning rear traction is rarely an issue. This allows us to push the on-throttle differential higher, but better drive out of the corners, and then set the off-throttle to 25%. With the geometry, once again, I've set it to left for everything, and for the suspension, I've gone 41 at the front, 4 at the rear, and then 14 and 18 on the anti-roll bars, which focuses on really good stability and car balance. Finally, set the ride height to 21 and 50, and this can give a slightly more stable car at slower and medium speeds. With the corners being so flowing, and there really just being one big stopping zone, we can lower the brake bias down to 52%. This will free the car up to rotate nicely, but if you do notice any rear locking at all, bump it up to 53 or 54% as needed. Then go 100% brake pressure as always. Finally, due to the relentless corners that just come at you one right after the other, set your tyre pressures to maximum to mitigate temperature buildup. The aero setup, we have one of the main culprits for why this track is so unenjoyable, and that's the incredibly long straights. These require as little aero as possible, so I've set the wings to 0 at the front and 3 at the rear. Going so low will maximise our straight line performance, while having 3 at the rear can help calm the back of the car down through some of the slipperier corners. The transmission is also designed to keep the rear of the car in check. Traction is incredibly valuable at Vegas, so an on-throttle differential of just 45% is ideal for minimising wheel spin. Then go with a low 25% off-throttle differential to help rotate the car into corners a bit better. With the geometry, go left as always. Then for the suspension, I've set the front to 41 and rear to 7. Lowering the rear suspension a bit will help with more traction. However, we do need the car to rotate mid-corner with our rear-focused aero setup. I've set the ARBs to 5 at the front and 21 at the rear. This will help the car feel a little more on its toes into and through corners. Finally, go 22 and 48 on the ride height. With the brakes, a 55% bias will keep the car stable under braking, but don't be afraid to lower it into turn 7 where a more rearward bias is preferred. You can go to 54, maybe even 53%. Then 100% brake pressure as always. Finally, tyres can be set away from the maximum, which is a nice change. Go with 27.6 psi on the fronts and 25.2 on both rears. For the front and rear wing, I've gone with a setup of 36 and 35. This is pretty neutral and balanced, and you don't really want an overly pointy car at Qatar, as many of the corners are long, and you do need pretty good rear downforce to keep the car facing the right direction. We can be a little bit more aggressive with the transmission though. I've opted for 75% on throttle differential. However, you can actually push this higher towards 100% if you are feeling confident in the car. This will give you good drive out of the long corners, and there aren't really too many heavy traction zones to be concerned about. Then an off-throttle diff of 35% is always a good go-to option. For the geometry, left once again, and then with our suspension setup you can be pretty aggressive with 41 and 1 on front and rear. Stability is needed, and we do cover that with the anti-roll bar setup of 15 and 19. Then set the ride height to 21 and 47, which is about as low as we can go before we start to scrape the track at certain points. With not many really heavy braking zones, we can set the bias a little more rearward at 53%. This will promote good rotation to some of those longer corners, and then go with 100% brake pressure. Qatar will punish your tyres in a similar way to a track like Spain, and this is due to the really high track temps and air temps and the flowing long corners that are littered around a lap. Go with maximum tyre pressures at all 4 corners to round out this Qatar car setup. Starting with our aero setup, I have the wings set up a little bit inverted, with priority at the rear of the car. I've gone with 24 and 25. The reason for this is that at many corners around Abu Dhabi, you are accelerating hard into and through the apex, and this really requires a planted rear end to maximise your performance onto the next straight. Turns 1, as well as pretty much the entirety of the final sector, are perfect examples where more rear downforce can help achieve better lap times. With these faster corners and the extra rear stability we get from our aero setup, we can push the on-throttle differential to 80%. This will give us the best drive through many of these corners. Then go with my favourite off-throttle setup of 35%. For the geometry, as normal, we've gone left, 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 left. And then for the suspension, go 41 at the front and 5 at the rear. Having the rear a little bit stiffer will help the car rotate slightly better mid-corner, and it can make up for some of the understeer that a rear-focused aero setup will naturally encounter. Then anti-roll bars set to 15 and 18 allow for a really stable car throughout a lap. Round out the suspension with 21 and 49 on the ride height. A brake bias of 54% is pretty perfect for the majority of the lap, and the only real exception is into the incredibly slow turn 6, which can favour a 55 or even 56% bias. You can make this adjustment via the MFD if needed. Then go 100% on the brake pressure. Finally, finish off our F125 car setups with maximum tyre pressures all around. The Marina has become much faster than it was in previous years, and this does result in punishing the tyres more than it did in the past. And that completes all of our F125 car setups for this year. I am so glad that EA and Codemasters haven't completely reworked the handling so far like they did last year. Although this may be the kiss of death and we're probably going to see a complete handling patch next week now that I've said that. But for now, I'm going to take a little bit of a break before looking at wet car setups. However, if you are craving some full wet or intermediate setups, do check out our Pro F125 setup pack, which has both wet weather setups ready to go, as well as 4 variations of dry setups, and a whole load more data including recommended strategies, tyre wear, information and more. But for now, stay safe, stay sexy, and I'll see you guys on track.